A street urchin saves a millionaire from kidnapping. But what seemed like a simple act of bravery uncovers a dark family secret. What connection does this girl have to the past he swore to forget? Arthur checked his watch impatiently as the city traffic held him prisoner in his luxury car. He was a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, and the chaos of the streets irritated him deeply. The horns sounded like a disorderly symphony, and on the other side of the windshield, pedestrians moved like fleeting shadows under the dim light of the streetlights. In a nearby corner, Lara watched from the shadows. Her thin body, wrapped in worn clothing, was barely visible in the shadows. At just 14, she had learned to read people with an eerie accuracy. She could tell the distracted from the attentive, the generous from the indifferent, and the elegant man in the black car didn't seem like the type to share a few coins. Yet something in his expression caught her attention, a flash of vulnerability that made him different. As Lara assessed the situation, a sudden movement broke the monotony. Two men with covered faces approached Arthur's car. One of them hit the window with a gun while the other forced the door open. Arthur barely had time to react before being dragged out of the vehicle. Lara held her breath. She had seen many things on the streets, but this was different. The kidnappers looked professional, and Arthur, despite his haughty demeanor, was completely at their mercy. Something inside her, an instinct she didn't understand, screamed at her to intervene. With stealthy steps, Lara approached the place. At the moment when the men pushed Arthur towards a dark van, she acted. She grabbed a stone from the ground and threw it with all her strength against a nearby glass, breaking it into 1,000 pieces. The crash resounded like a gunshot, attracting the attention of the kidnappers. "Police!" she shouted in a firm voice, pretending to be a witness alerting the authorities. The men panicked. One of them tried to run towards the noise, but the other, more nervous, insisted on leaving before attracting more attention. In the confusion, Arthur took advantage to break free and, staggering, ran towards a nearby alley, closely followed by Lara. When they were finally safe, Arthur turned to the girl, his face still pale with fear. What did you do?" he asked between gasps. "I saved you, didn't I?" Lara replied in a carefree tone, although her heart was beating fast. Arthur didn't know how to react. On the one hand, he was grateful for the girl's intervention. On the other, he couldn't trust someone who seemed so out of place. He brushed the dust off his jacket and tried to regain his composure. "What do you want in return?" he asked, looking at Lara with distrust. "Nothing," she said with a shrug. "I just did what I thought was right." Arthur frowned. He was not used to selfless kindness, and the girl's attitude puzzled him. Yet something in her eyes, a mixture of defiance and sadness, made him hesitate. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he finally asked, not quite understanding why she cared. Lara shook her head. She was silent for a moment, but then added, "Don't worry, I'm used to taking care of myself." Arthur sighed, looking around. The streets weren't a safe place, especially after what had just happened. Even though his instincts told him to get away from that stray girl, a part of him couldn't leave her alone. "Come with me for now," he said finally, more as an order than an invitation. Lara looked at him in surprise but didn't answer. She simply followed him in silence, unaware that this impulsive act would change their lives forever. Arthur and Lara arrived at the imposing tower where he was temporarily residing, a building that seemed to defy the sky with its modernity and luxury. Lara followed him in silence, glancing sideways at the marble walls and furniture that gleamed as if they had never been touched. It was a completely foreign world to her. The elevator stopped at the top floor, and when it opened, it revealed a shell that looked more like a museum than a home. Lara paused at the threshold, as if afraid of dirtying the floor with her worn shoes. Arthur noticed her hesitation, but said nothing. He just left his briefcase on a glass table and walked to the bar. "There's a bathroom at the back on the right," he said without looking at her, while he poured a drink of whiskey. "Use it if you need to." Lara watched him, trying to decipher his intentions. She had learned to distrust everyone, and Arthur was no exception. However, the warmth of the place and the promise of hot water were too tempting. Without saying a word, she headed for the bathroom, carefully closing the door behind her. Arthur sighed as he plopped down on the couch. His mind was still processing what had happened. The kidnapping, Laura's intervention, and now the strange situation of having her under his roof. He wasn't used to the closeness of others, much less someone so different from him. When Laura came out of the bathroom, she was wearing the same outfit as before, but her face and hands were now clean. Her hair, still wet, fell messily over her shoulders. She looked younger, almost vulnerable, but her gaze was still filled with that characteristic distrust. "Are you hungry?" Arthur asked, breaking the awkward silence. Laura nodded cautiously. Arthur called the delivery service, and minutes later, a dinner arrived that looked more like a banquet than a simple meal. Laura ate quickly, as if she were afraid someone would snatch her plate away. Arthur, from across the table, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "Have you always lived on the streets?" he finally asked. Laura put down her fork and looked him straight in the eyes. "Why do you care?" he replied in a defiant tone. Arthur didn't answer right away. He realized he didn't have a good reason. Maybe it was just his sense of duty, or maybe there was something deeper that he couldn't quite grasp. "It doesn't matter," he said at last. "You can stay here tonight. We'll see what to do with you tomorrow." Laura didn't answer, but remained silent as she pulled a small object wrapped in a handkerchief from her backpack. She carefully unfolded it, revealing an old, worn photograph. Arthur couldn't help but notice the gesture. "Who is it?" he asked with genuine curiosity. Laura quickly put the photo away again, as if it were too valuable a secret. "It's the only thing I have left," she said in a low voice, avoiding looking at him. Arthur understood that he would not get any more answers for the moment, but that photograph, in the way Laura protected it, aroused in him an intrigue that he could not ignore. The light of dawn filtered through the windows of the roof, illuminating the elegant details of the room. Laura was sitting on the floor next to a glass table, looking at the photograph she had protected all her life. It was a blurry image, somewhat worn by time, but in it she could clearly make out the face of a woman with a warm smile. Arthur, who had been quietly making coffee, noticed the girl's rapt expression. He was not usually a person curious about other people's lives, but something about Laura, about her untold story, made him uneasy. "Is this your mother?" he asked in a neutral tone as he approached with a cup in his hand. Laura looked up and for a moment seemed to debate whether to answer or ignore him. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Yes," he said in a small voice. "I don't remember much about her, but this photo is the only thing I have, so I don't forget her." Arthur put the cup down on the table and leaned over to look at the picture. At first it seemed like just another photograph, but something about the woman's face seemed strangely familiar. He frowned, trying to place in his memory that smile that seemed to have crossed his mind at some point. "Where did you get it?" he asked, trying hard to keep his tone casual. "I always had it," Laura replied, shrugging her shoulders. "It's the only thing left when they left me." Arthur felt a slight knot in his stomach at that. Although he still didn't fully trust the girl, he couldn't ignore the vulnerability in her words. His eyes shifted back to the photograph, as if searching for something more, some detail that would confirm the growing suspicion that was beginning to form in his mind. Suddenly, he stood up without saying anything and walked to a small desk at the other end of the room. He opened a drawer, rummaging through papers and documents. Laura watched him curiously, not understanding what he was looking for. "What are you doing?" he finally asked. Arthur returned with an old photo album. He placed it on the table and began flipping through the pages quickly, stopping short at one picture. The photo showed a group of people at a corporate event many years ago. Arthur pointed to a woman in the corner, standing next to a dark-haired man. "Is this your mother?" he asked, showing her the picture. Laura took the album with trembling hands, comparing the photograph in the album to her own. There was no doubt. It was the same woman. "Yes, it's her," he murmured, his eyes wide. Arthur leaned back on the couch, trying to process what he had just discovered. Not only did the woman look familiar, he was certain he had met her in the past. And while he didn't fully understand the connection, he knew it wasn't a coincidence. For the first time since Laura had entered his life, Arthur felt a genuine need to know more. Something inside him told him that this girl and her photograph were the key to unearthing secrets he didn't even know existed. The afternoon was moving slowly on Arthur's cover. Lara was sitting in an armchair too big for her small frame, holding her mother's photograph as if it was a shield. Arthur's question hung in the air. How did you end up living on the streets? Lara looked out the window, where the city lights were beginning to light up like earthly stars. It wasn't an easy question to answer, but for some reason, she felt that Arthur deserved at least part of the truth. I didn't always live like this, she began, her voice barely a whisper. When I was little, I remember having a house. It wasn't big or pretty like this one, but it was a home. My mom took care of me, made me laugh. Arthur noticed how Lara's voice trembled as she spoke. He remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. One day she left. Lara squeezed the photograph between her fingers. She left home and never came back. They told me she had been taken away, that she was sick, but I don't know if that was true. She paused, searching for the right words to follow. Arthur sensed that each word was an effort for her, a wound that was slowly reopening. At first I stayed with a lady who lived nearby, but she didn't like having me there. She said I was a nuisance, so she left me in a place with other children. It was a horrible place. Lara swallowed, trying to contain her emotion. I ran away. Arthur frowned. Lara's story was painfully familiar, as if every detail resonated with something he'd heard or seen before, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. Since then, I've learned to manage on my own, she continued. Living on the streets isn't easy, but at least no one tells me what to do. Arthur crossed his arms, reflecting on what he had just heard. He had known the harshness of the world from another perspective, but he had never imagined what it meant to live without a support network, without a home. Have you ever tried to find your mother? He finally asked. I always look for her, said Lara, holding up the photograph. But this is the only memory I have of her. Arthur stared at the picture for a moment, his mind analyzing every detail. There was something in that woman's eyes that made him uneasy, a connection he couldn't ignore. But before he could say anything, his phone rang. He stood up to answer, walking away a few steps. As he spoke in a low voice, Lara stared out the window, lost in her thoughts. What neither of them knew was that at that very moment, the men who had tried to kidnap Arthur were watching from the shadows. Their presence was unnoticed, but their intentions were clear. Arthur and Lara represented a danger that could not be allowed to happen. The morning at the newsroom began with an unusual silence. Lara had gotten up early and, as if trying not to disturb other people's space, sat in a corner with her mother's photograph in her hands. Arthur, meanwhile, was in his office, going through old documents. The conversation from the previous night still echoed in his mind. There was something about Lara's story, about that photograph, that wouldn't leave him alone. On a hunch, he turned on his personal computer and accessed his company's historical files. The company, built over decades by his family, had buried secrets that even he didn't fully know about. While reviewing contracts and personnel records from years past, one name caught his eye. Enrique Vargas. Enrique had been a close associate of his father for more than 20 years. He vaguely remembered hearing about him as a child, but his memory was hazy. What troubled him most, however, was another name that appeared alongside Enrique in several documents: Clara Vargas. Arthur zoomed in on a file containing an old photograph from a corporate event. There was Enrique, standing next to a woman with dark hair and a warm smile. The breath left his chest as he realized that this woman was the same one in Lara's photo. He leaned back in his chair, trying to process the revelation. If Lara was indeed Enrique and Clara's daughter, it meant she was connected to a dark part of his family's history. Enrique had disappeared with his wife suddenly, leaving behind rumors of business disputes and an alleged financial scandal. His father never spoke of the subject, as if trying to erase it from the collective memory. Arthur closed the computer and stood up, heading for the living room. Lara watched him from her corner, alert, as if she could sense that something important was about to happen. "Lara, can I see your picture again?" he asked, trying hard to keep his tone calm. Lara looked at him suspiciously but finally nodded, handing him the image. Arthur compared it to the photo in the file he had printed. There was no doubt it was the same woman. "Your mother, Clara Vargas," he murmured softly, returning the photograph to Lara. The girl looked at him confused. "Do you know her?" Arthur nodded slowly, trying to find the right words to explain what he had just discovered. "Not personally, but I think it may be connected to someone who worked with my family a long time ago." Lara frowned, processing the information. "Do you think you know where it is?" Arthur shook his head. "I don't know, but I can try to find out." At that moment, her phone vibrated on the table. It was a text message from an unknown number. "We know what you're looking for. Stop digging if you value your life and that of the girl." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. The threat was clear, and although it didn't mention names, he was sure it came from the same men who had tried to kidnap him. He kept the message to himself, but a new urgency washed over him. He knew he was treading on dangerous ground, but he also knew he could no longer turn back. If Lara was really Henrique and Clara's daughter, then his family had a lot to answer for. "Lara," he said finally, "I need you to trust me. We're going to find out what happened to your mother, but you have to be prepared. This might not be easy." Lara stared at him, a mix of hope and fear in her eyes. "I'm ready," she answered firmly. Arthur nodded, though deep down he knew that neither of them were truly prepared for what was to come. The tension in the coverage was palpable. Arthur had spent most of the day making discreet calls and reviewing more documents in search of answers. Lara, though intrigued, remained on the sidelines, watching him from a distance. She knew something had changed since he mentioned his mother's name to her, but Arthur wasn't sharing too many details. As night fell, Arthur decided they needed to move. The threats he had received were not something he could ignore, and staying in one place made them vulnerable. "We're leaving," he said as he put documents into a briefcase and disconnected his laptop. "Where to?" Lara asked, frowning. "To a safer place. Trust me." Although Lara didn't answer, she followed him without complaint. They went down to the underground parking lot, where Arthur's armored car was waiting for them. The silence during the ride was almost unbearable. Arthur kept his gaze fixed on the road, while Lara looked out the window with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. However, that tense calm was suddenly shattered. At a deserted intersection, a dark vehicle blocked their way. Before Arthur could react, another car appeared behind them, cutting off any possible escape. "Stay down!" Arthur shouted as he bent down to search for something in the glove compartment. Lara, her heart pounding, obeyed immediately. Through the windows, she could make out several armed men approaching the vehicle. Fear filled her, but so did a spark of courage that she could not ignore. Arthur got out of the car with his hands raised, trying to buy time. "You don't have to do this," he shouted, his voice firm but full of tension. "Tell whoever sent you that we can negotiate." One of the men, apparently the leader, approached with a cold smile. "We are not here to negotiate, Mr. Almeida. You already know too much, and that girl cannot continue living." Arthur felt a knot in his stomach as he heard those words. He knew that the intentions of these men were clear, and there was no room for error. Meanwhile, Lara, hidden inside the car, watched intently. Her mind was working fast, searching for some way to help. Then her eyes fell on the horn control. An idea formed in her mind. Carefully, he reached out and pressed the horn intermittently, creating a deafening noise that echoed throughout the street. The men, startled, turned toward the car, momentarily losing concentration. That moment was all Arthur needed. He took advantage of the distraction to snatch the gun from the nearest man and fire into the air, causing the others to retreat. "Lara, get out of the car!" Arthur shouted as he fired a second shot to keep the men at bay. Lara opened the door and ran towards him, her heart beating like a drum. Arthur took her arm and they ran into a nearby alley, leaving the car and their attackers behind. When they finally found shelter in an old abandoned warehouse, they were both out of breath. Arthur slumped against a wall while Lara stared at him with wide eyes. "Is it always like this with you?" he asked, trying to ease the tension with a sarcastic comment. Arthur let out a bitter laugh. "No, but it seems that everything is more complicated with you." Despite his fear, a faint smile appeared on Lara's lips. For the first time, Arthur felt that he was not alone on this dangerous path. And although he would not admit it out loud, he knew that without Lara, he would not have come out of that ambush alive. The calm in the old warehouse was only superficial. Arthur, leaning against a worn brick wall, mentally reviewed recent events. He knew that the attack had not been a coincidence, that the men who tried to catch them were protecting something much bigger, something that was directly related to his family. Laura sat in the corner, watching Arthur check his phone with a grim expression. Although she was used to facing danger, she had never felt the level of threat she had experienced that night. She knew Arthur was hiding something, but she didn't want to push him, at least not yet. Finally, Arthur put away his phone and walked over. He sat down across from Laura, and for the first time since they met, his expression was not one of distrust, but of genuine concern. "Laura," he began in a serious tone, "there is something you need to know." The girl looked at him, confused. "What's happening?" Arthur took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Your mother, Clara, and your father, Henrique, did not disappear by chance." Laura felt a knot in her stomach. "What do you mean?" Arthur looked away for a moment, as if meeting Laura's eyes made what he was about to say any more difficult. "My father," he paused, feeling the weight of each word. "He was responsible for her disappearance." The silence that followed was unbearable. Laura stared at him, incredulous, as if she couldn't process what she had just heard. "Your father?" she repeated in a low voice with a tremor in her voice. Arthur nodded slowly. He and Henrique were partners in the company, but there were problems, differences that turned into something darker. "My father discovered that Henrique knew too much about certain illegal activities within the company and decided to eliminate him and your mother to protect his legacy." The words echoed in Lara's head. For years, she had dreamed of answers about her mother's disappearance, but she had never imagined anything so cruel. "So, this is all your family's fault," he said, standing up abruptly, his voice cracking with rage and pain. "Why should I trust you?" Arthur stood up as well, spreading his hands in a calming gesture. "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me or trust me, but I need you to understand that I'm trying to fix things. I can't change what my father did, but I can make sure the truth comes out." Laura stared at him, her breathing quickening. Part of her wanted to run away, to get away from the man who represented everything she had lost. But another, deeper part of her told her that Arthur was being sincere. "What if they kill you before you can tell the truth?" he asked in a defiant tone. Arthur gave a bitter smile. "Then it will be your turn to fight for her." Silence filled the space between them again, but this time it was laden with a new determination. Laura knew the path ahead would be dangerous, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. The tension had not eased since the last revelation. Arthur and Laura moved into a new haven, a small apartment on the outskirts of the city that Arthur had used in the past for discreet meetings. The place was austere, almost empty, but at least it offered them a temporary respite. While Laura sat on the couch, distracted by her thoughts, Arthur reviewed documents on his laptop. The information he had found about Henrique and Clara worried him, but there was something else that worried him: the circle of trust in his company. An unexpected call interrupted his thoughts. The name on the screen made him frown. Bernardo, his current partner and right-hand man in the company. "What's wrong?" Arthur asked as he answered, trying to sound unconcerned. "We need to talk, Arthur. It's urgent," Bernardo said, his tone unusually tense. "It's what you're investigating." Arthur hesitated. He knew Bernardo had been by his side for years, but after everything that had happened, his trust was deeply shaken. "What do you know about that?" he replied, trying to hide his caution. "Not by phone. Come to the office tonight, when everything is quieter. I'll explain everything to you." Arthur hung up, but the unease inside him grew. Something wasn't right, and every fiber of his being told him that Bernardo was hiding something. Hours later, he left Laura in the apartment under the promise that he would not open the door to anyone. Although the girl protested, Arthur insisted that it was safer for both of them if she stayed. When he arrived at the office, the building was almost empty. The dim light from a lamp in the meeting room illuminated Bernardo's figure, who was waiting with a serious expression. "What's so important that we couldn't discuss it before?" Arthur asked, crossing his arms. Bernardo stared at him as if he were considering how much to say. Finally, he let out a sigh. "Arthur, you shouldn't have started digging up the past. Some things are better left buried." Arthur felt a chill. What are you talking about? About what your father did and what I helped cover up, Bernardo admitted, lowering his gaze. Arthur stood still, processing what he had just heard. What about you? I was part of everything, Arthur. I knew what your father planned to do with Henrique and Clara, and I made sure the information never got out. I thought we would protect the company, but I never imagined this would come back to haunt us. Anger and disappointment mixed on Arthur's face. Is that why they tried to kidnap me? So I wouldn't find out anything? Bernardo nodded, but there was something else in his gaze, something he didn't say. It wasn't just that, he finally confessed. It's that girl, Lara. Her existence puts everything we've built at risk. Those behind this won't stop until they eliminate her. Arthur clenched his fists, controlling the urge to punch his former friend. You're on the wrong side, Bernardo, he said in a cold voice. This ends here. Bernardo looked at him with a mixture of pity and warning. Arthur, if you continue down this path, you won't get out alive. But Arthur had already made his decision. No matter what it took, he was willing to face anything to protect Lara and expose the truth. Night had fallen over the city, enveloping it in a gloom that seemed to herald the imminent outcome. Arthur and Lara were on the move, leaving the apartment behind after receiving a crucial lead from the police. An old company informant had shared the location of an abandoned factory where Bernardo and his allies operated in secret. It was there that the threads of this intricate web of lies would finally unravel. Arthur looked at Lara as he drove. Her face was serious, but her eyes held a determination he had never seen before. This is going to be dangerous, Lara, he said, breaking the silence. I want you to stay in the car when we get there. Don't even think about it, she replied, crossing her arms. If all this has to do with my mother and my past, I'm not going to be left behind. Arthur sighed. He knew that arguing with Lara was useless, and deep down, he admired her bravery. They reached the outskirts of the city, where the factory stood like a forgotten giant among piles of scrap metal and rusty walls. The flickering lights inside indicated that they were not alone. Arthur got out of the car, adjusting the earpiece that kept him in contact with the undercover officers stationed nearby. Remember, I want you to intervene only when I give the signal, he murmured into the microphone. Lara followed closely behind, her heart pounding. They entered the building, moving cautiously through the shadows. The echo of their footsteps resonated as a reminder of how dangerous this place was. In the center of the factory, a makeshift table was surrounded by several armed men. Bernardo stood in the middle, looking calm but with watchful eyes. When he saw Arthur and Lara appear, a bitter smile appeared on his face. I knew you would come, Bernardo said, slowly standing up. Always so predictable. This is the end of it, Bernardo, Arthur replied, keeping his voice firm. End? Bernardo replied sarcastically. Arthur, you don't understand. This isn't just about your family or the girl. It's about power, about keeping what we've built intact. Arthur stepped forward, ignoring the guns pointed at him. You can't hide the truth forever. The police already have enough to incriminate you and everyone else involved. A flash of nervousness crossed Bernardo's face, but he quickly recovered. And you think you'll get out of here alive to achieve it? At that moment, one of the armed men moved towards Arthur, but before he could react, a loud noise rang out. Lara, who had taken an old pipe from the ground, had hit him, knocking him out. Chaos erupted. Officers stormed the factory, sparking a standoff between law enforcement and Bernardo's men. Arthur protected Lara as they took shelter behind some crates, but when Bernardo tried to escape amid the mayhem, Arthur followed him. He caught up with him on a staircase leading to a high platform. This is over, Bernardo, said Arthur, blocking his way. You don't understand what you're doing, Arthur, Bernardo replied, sweat running down his forehead. If the truth comes to light, you will destroy everything your father built. Arthur stared at him, a mixture of rage and resolve. My father has destroyed enough lives. It's time for justice. Officers arrived seconds later, handcuffing Bernardo as Arthur walked back to Lara. When he saw her, his heart settled. She was safe. For the first time in a long time, Arthur felt like they had won, although he knew the most important battle was yet to come. The light of dawn was beginning to tint the sky when Arthur and Lara left the police station. The night had been long, full of interrogations and testimonies, But finally, Bernardo and his accomplices were in custody. The dark secrets of the company and the Almeida family were beginning to come to light. Arthur stopped in front of the car, taking a breath of fresh air. He felt the weight of recent events on his shoulders, but also a slight sense of relief. He had made the decision to face his family's legacy, and although he knew the road would be difficult, he was willing to walk it. Bernardo looked at him with a mixture of pity and warning. "Arthur, if you continue down this path, you won't get out alive." But Arthur had already made his decision. No matter what it took, he was willing to face anything to protect Lara and expose the truth. Night had fallen over the city, enveloping it in a gloom that seemed to herald the imminent outcome. Arthur and Lara were on the move, leaving the apartment behind after receiving a crucial lead from the police. An old company informant had shared the location of an abandoned factory where Bernardo and his allies operated in secret. It was there that the threads of this intricate web of lies would finally unravel. Arthur looked at Lara as he drove. Her face was serious, but her eyes held a determination he had never seen before. "This is going to be dangerous, Lara," he said, breaking the silence. "I want you to stay in the car when we get there." "Don't even think about it," she replied, crossing her arms. "If all this has to do with my mother and my past, I'm not going to be left behind." Arthur sighed. He knew that arguing with Lara was useless, and deep down, he admired her bravery. They reached the outskirts of the city, where the factory stood like a forgotten giant among piles of scrap metal and rusty walls. The flickering lights inside indicated that they were not alone. Arthur got out of the car, adjusting the earpiece that kept him in contact with the undercover officer stationed nearby. "Remember, I want you to intervene only when I give the signal," he murmured into the microphone. Lara followed closely behind, her heart pounding. They entered the building, moving cautiously through the shadows. The echo of their footsteps resonated as a reminder of how dangerous this place was. In the center of the factory, a makeshift table was surrounded by several armed men. Bernardo stood in the middle, looking calm but with watchful eyes. When he saw Arthur and Lara appear, a bitter smile appeared on his face. "I knew you would come," Bernardo said, slowly standing up. "Always so predictable." "This is the end of it, Bernardo," Arthur replied, keeping his voice firm. "End?" Bernardo replied sarcastically. "Arthur, you don't understand. This isn't just about your family or the girl. It's about power, about keeping what we've built intact." Arthur stepped forward, ignoring the guns pointed at him. "You can't hide the truth forever. The police already have enough to incriminate you and everyone else involved." A flash of nervousness crossed Bernardo's face, but he quickly recovered. "And you think you'll get out of here alive to achieve it?" At that moment, one of the armed men moved towards Arthur, but before he could react, a loud noise rang out. Lara, who had taken an old pipe from the ground, had hit him, knocking him out. Chaos erupted. Officers stormed the factory, sparking a standoff between law enforcement and Bernardo's men. Arthur protected Lara as they took shelter behind some crates, but when Bernardo tried to escape amid the mayhem, Arthur followed him. He caught up with him on a staircase leading to a high platform. "This is over, Bernardo," said Arthur, blocking his way. "You don't understand what you're doing, Arthur," Bernardo replied, sweat running down his forehead. "If the truth comes to light, you will destroy everything your father built." Arthur stared at him, a mixture of rage and resolve. "My father has destroyed enough lives. It's time for justice." Officers arrived seconds later, handcuffing Bernardo as Arthur walked back to Lara. When he saw her, his heart settled. She was safe. For the first time in a long time, Arthur felt like they had won, although he knew the most important battle was yet to come. The light of dawn was beginning to tint the sky when Arthur and Lara left the police station. The night had been long, full of interrogations and testimonies, but finally Bernardo and his accomplices were in custody. The dark secrets of the company and the Almeida family were beginning to come to light. Arthur stopped in front of the car, taking a breath of fresh air. He felt the weight of recent events on his shoulders, but also a slight sense of relief. He had made the decision to face his family's legacy, and although he knew the road would be difficult, he was willing to walk it. Lara, at his side, held the photograph of her mother tightly. She hadn't said much since the confrontation at the factory, but Arthur could tell her mind was working intensely. "What are you going to do now?" Arthur asked, breaking the silence as he looked at her intently. Lara looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and vulnerability. "I want to know more about my mother. I want to know who she was, what happened to her. Everything." Arthur nodded slowly. "We'll find out together," he said in a firm tone. "I promise you." Back on the beat, Arthur began to organize the documents he had accumulated during the investigation. He knew that facing the past meant not only revealing the truth, but also accepting the consequences. On television, the newscasts were already talking about the scandal at the Almeida company, mentioning his father and the acts that had been buried for years. Laura, meanwhile, walked around the room with the photograph in her hand. Her expression was serious, but there was something new in it. Hope. "What will happen to you?" he asked suddenly, turning to Arthur. Arthur put the papers aside and looked at her sincerely. "What I did tonight wasn't just for you, Laura. It was also for me. My family built their empire on lies, and now it's my responsibility to fix it. I'll have to face the consequences, but I don't care." Laura watched him silently for a moment before approaching him. "Thank you," she said softly, and even though it was just one word, it carried with it the weight of everything she had experienced. Arthur smiled, feeling a genuine connection with Laura. "Thanks to you too," he replied. "Without you, I wouldn't have had the courage to go this far." The next few days were filled with change. Arthur began collaborating with the authorities, handing over evidence that would not only dismantle the company's corrupt operations, but also clear the names of those who had suffered in the process. Meanwhile, he set about searching for more information about Clara, convinced that there were still pieces of the puzzle left to uncover. For Laura, it meant more than just answers. It meant a new chance, a life away from the streets and abandonment. Though she still carried the scars of her past, she now had something she'd never had before: an ally, someone willing to walk beside her. On a quiet afternoon, the two sat on the rooftop terrace, watching the sun set over the city. "Do you think we can find her?" Laura asked, looking at the horizon. Arthur paused before answering, but when he did, his voice was firm. "I think we can handle anything." Laura smiled for the first time in days, and in that moment, they both understood that the path to redemption was not the end, but the beginning of something new.